Zvuk Misli.
Podcast Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju.
Hello everyone, my name is Filip Balunović. Welcome to another podcast, The Sound of Thought, the podcast by the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, University of Belgrade. Our today's guest is Renata Salecl, a Slovenian philosopher and an author of numerous books from the field of psychoanalysis. Her books, such as On Anxiety, The Tyranny of Choice, and the last published, Passion for Ignorance, are some of the reasons and some of the topics that we are going to cover in today's conversation. Renata, welcome to Belgrade and welcome to the podcast of Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, The Sound of Thought.
Yeah, hello.
So let's start with the notion of anxiety, something you have been dealing with for, let's say, over 2 decades, since the first book On Anxiety in 2004 onwards. Can we explain a little bit the very term of anxiety? What does it mean in theoretical terms, but also in practical terms?
Anxiety has been discussed in philosophy and psychoanalysis, psychology, of course, in very different ways. Usually we perceive that there is a difference between fear and anxiety, that in anxiety we don't really know what we are anxious about. When we are in fear, then we can say, yes, I fear barking dogs, I fear, high-rise buildings or something like that. But in anxiety it's difficult to point at what's the object. However, philosophers from Kierkegaard on, and then later, psychoanalysts, Freud, Lacan, and so on, have even more complicated the issue of anxiety. But like the red thread is that anxiety is very much a human feeling. We know that animals have fear, but we are not sure whether they have anxiety, because anxiety with us humans involves also our intersubjective relationships. We are not only anxious in regards to some threats coming, from outside. The anxiety is linked also to sort of our dealing with the sort of subjective, the lack that marks us as subject, as Jacques Lacan would point out. And anxiety very much involves also us dealing with the question, who are we as people? How are we regarded by others? How are we regarded, by someone that we are in a special relationship with? That's why love is very anxiety-provoking. And what I was analyzing in my book on anxiety was, how does this subjective feeling of anxiety go together with the cultural production of anxiety? We are living truly for some decades now in highly anxious situations, where it is not simply, the actually social threats that are making us anxious. The media, for example, are constantly creating anxieties. If we watch continuously frightening images from television, we can start feeling more anxious than if we, for example, ignore them. So my idea was why ideology, especially ideology of today's type of capitalism, actually very much needs an anxious subject. And sort of that led me to the second book after the anxiety, The Tyranny of Choice, where my idea was that, this anxiety feeling that ideology, contemporary ideology, which we refer to usually as neoliberal ideology, provokes, is quite essential for the type of capitalism in which we live to continue.
Is there a specific era or a specific time? You mentioned the capitalist time, let's say the previous 6 or 7 decades.
Yeah.
But even before that, anxiety is something that is essential to human beings, to their, as you mentioned, intersubjective relationship. And then there are, I assume, systems that provoke anxiety more or less. Is there today in the contemporary world let's say, a photo robot of a human being who belongs to a certain class, who does certain job, who's more inclined towards, feeling more anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we look at our transitional times in the, let's say, Yugoslav sphere, since we went from, the socialist structure and the common state into, these fragmented small countries and, sort of like a kind of a capitalism that we are living in, we can see a difference in regard to anxiety. If we look at the example of news, in the former Yugoslavia, news were boring. I remember as a child, watching the news. We were reading something, we were knitting, the news were sort of in the background. There was a kind of a monotonous voice of the speaker reading the news. And then suddenly I noticed with the transition to capitalism, our news became like American news, which made me physically anxious whenever I heard the news, Always when I heard this kind of high voices, excitation of the speakers, I was thinking, what's happening, And nothing was happening, A cat was lost or, something totally banal. But the way they were presenting it, and we were actually imitating the Western type of a media presentation, was very different. Was, a kind of a small anxiety provoking thing. I'm not saying that this is like the major anxiety, but it started sort of kind of building up those kind of influences of anxiety. And then, of course, the next anxiety is related to our work situations. Wherever we are employed, we are, more and more anxious. Now, in the past, people were usually employed for a long time at the same firm. They often felt part of the community. They felt often respected, or they were feeling to be proud. I was going to high school in a very working class town, Ravne na Koroškem, which is the north of Slovenia, where they had steel industry. So in this working class city, people were feeling incredibly connected to the factory. They were sort of like proud to be proletarians, and also felt secured with, the small earnings. Nonetheless, they felt part of the community. We were living an okay life, and this factory was, a kind of a patriarch taking care of many of their needs, from the housing also to their sports activities and so on. And as soon as, the change happened, I would say an anxiety in regard to the work situation, emerged. The competitiveness, the feeling that you are constantly afraid, to lose your job. And also this kind of a feeling that another is not part of your group, but is someone with whom you are constantly in competition for the little, bonuses that maybe, one will get and the other will not get. So today's capitalism relies on the feeling of anxiety that we have in regard to who are we, also how are we respected or not at workplace, but also elsewhere. Since if we look at the social media, there is still another type of anxiety that we are dealing with. There's been a lot of study around Instagram. Especially women are, feeling anxious when they are observing images of other women who appear to have better lives, more perfect bodies, and especially those young women who are posting their own images often, feel that they are, quite inadequate in regard not only to film stars or, other influencers, but their own friends who are posting, their images. And so I would say this anxiety has been growing, but also the feeling that everything is in our own hands, that we make choices about how we look. Are we healthy or not? Our kids are happy or not? That is creating the anxiety, this enormous responsibility, which comes together with what I call, is the tyranny of choice of neoliberalism.
How do we? You mentioned at the beginning you mentioned the term fear, and we kind of know, or we can intuitively conclude, or we can understand how fear is linked or connected to anxiety. But you also mentioned another term, which is uncertainty. And I was wondering, how do we resolve this, in a way, dialectical relationship between anxiety and uncertainty, which is sometimes also framed as dynamical way of life? So we are told that we should live in a dynamic way, that uncertainty is not something bad, but something good that drives us. But at the same time, uncertainty and this dynamic affects strongly our inclination towards more anxiety. How do we resolve this puzzle?
Yeah, already Søren Kierkegaard, who is, one of the most important philosophers about anxiety, was saying that actually uncertainty, which he also links to freedom, is anxiety provoking, sort of like as such, like to have the perception that there is an openness, that there is freedom. It might be, paralyzing for someone. And I would say in today's ideology, this idea that you, in principle, are free to create out of your life whatever you want, is creating the anxiety. Since, first of all, this is, very much an ideological motto of today's capitalism. Everything is in your hands, You can go from poverty to huge success. That's kind of the illusion, which goes on, I would say, from the start of capitalism. But, from rags to riches, it was, the motto that, especially in the United States, were talking about at the start of capitalism. But today, that has kind of intensified in the feeling that, you can, sort of kind of go to extreme riches if only you have a great idea, if only you work hard, if only you make the right choices. And here what we are neglecting are all the constraints of our environment, our society, our economic situation, or, let's say broader social sphere. We are living in very, very traumatic times with wars, with ecological catastrophes, also very unsustainable development of societies. So people have limited choices. Now, what I also observed when I was looking at Tyranny of Choice is that there is a huge difference in how we perceive choice today. And let's say in the democratic process, the idea of choice and the idea, of course, often of rights, especially, let's say, human rights, is related to a perception of abstract subject, a subject who is not defined by his or her economic situation or, gender, race. So the idea is that, everyone, regardless of all this, nationality, race, sexual orientation, poverty, and so on, has certain rights. Mm-hmm. However, when we moved into the idea of choices, we are losing this abstract character, which is kind of at the core of our idea of democracy or human rights. We are moving to the subject who can make choices only if he or she has economic means. Mm-hmm. And, that first happened already in the United States in the 70s over the discussions about abortion. Mm-hmm. At first, they were speaking about the right to abortion. And then they started speaking about the right to choose. Mm-hmm. And that shift involved, economic means. At that moment, for example, also the state stopped allowing, Medicaid, the kind of public money to be used for abortions. Abortions became something payable, something that only people who have money, they can afford. And more choices now are linked to whether you have economic means to make them or not. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned at some point wars, and this is something you begin with your book on anxiety, and then you also, in the first couple of paragraphs, even though the book was written exactly 20 years ago, you also mention pandemics, epidemics, and this post-war or post-crisis in general terms condition, which might be something that provokes anxiety further. You dealt a lot with trauma also that comes out from the traumatic experiences of war specifically, whether we're talking about soldiers who fought in war or we're talking about victims of war, of victims of war crimes, rape, and atrocities of that kind. So I was wondering about this linkage between trauma and anxiety, and we've gone through another pandemic in recent years, but then the contemporary capitalist system does not stop producing wars over and over again. So I was wondering also in general terms, but also in this specific terms of contemporary era, what's the linkage between trauma and anxiety and how we deal with it?
Yeah, this is a very important question. Since Freud, when he looked at anxiety, he linked it in a very particular way with trauma. He was pointing out that, let's say, you might have a traumatic experience. His example was that people are victims in a train crash accident. And he said there will not be a universal feeling of anxiety, or there will not be, kind of necessary a traumatic memory of this accident by all of the people who were, victims. Some might develop trauma, others might not, which he says that means that traumatic memory is something very subjective. But then he said anxiety often emerges after traumatic experience. So people who were involved in a train crash who survived after might have the feeling of anxiety, as soon as they would see another train, or they would think about the train crash, or some would be paralyzed to take another train. And he said this feeling of anxiety, which emerges after trauma, is like a protection. It is a protective shield, which we sort of hope, that will help us if another accident happens, that we will be in a way prepared. So anxiety might be beneficial for us. If we don't have a feeling of anxiety, let's say it might be that we expose ourselves more to certain dangers. However, with some people, anxiety can become too strong. They become paralyzed because of that. But in regard to war, which is sort of analysis that I end the anxiety book with, an interesting thing happens when people who are engaged with war, in war, let's say soldiers, do not have anxiety. And that was, I came to this thinking when I interviewed someone who was engaged on the American side in the Iraq war. Now, I asked this soldier, how does he deal with the anxiety of his colleagues when he is in a situation of war? He was kind of leading a small group of soldiers, and he said, actually, my horror is not when I have anxious soldiers. My horror is when I have soldiers who have no anxiety. And that was because he said, when I see a person without anxiety in a war situation, who has the power to shoot, to kill others, then I'm questioning, what kind of a person this is. Is this, a kind of a psychopathic person who is willing to kill without, any feeling of guilt, about what he is doing. And that's kind of an interesting moment when we see sort of the lack of anxiety related to people in power, or, in people who are engaged in, possibly, let's say, killing in a war type of a situation. And, actually, nowadays we see that, artificial intelligence is sometimes used so that people will not deal with their anxiety. And, artificial intelligence in war is perceived as a mechanism, which is a kind of a cold way of killing. We are seeing that in the war in Gaza, where they are using artificial intelligence to determine which buildings will be targeted, with the idea that in some buildings Hamas might be hiding, while in reality it is building full of civilians. And when the artificial intelligence decides this is a target, the idea is we don't deal with the emotion of the soldier who actually, might need to make the decision. So, sort of outsourcing decision to artificial intelligence in some situations is a kind of a way, not to deal with the anxiety, feelings of guilt of humans, which is a very, very, dangerous path in which our society is developing.
How big is the responsibility of society as a whole to deal with post-traumatic experience of certain members of its population, or entire groups, or entire societies? We're now sitting in Belgrade, which has gone through, let's say, a collective traumatic experience with the school shooting almost exactly a year ago. Do you think that discussing anxiety in post-traumatic context is in a way taboo?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes. As it is, the discussion about the guilt, for, some atrocities that society has engaged with in the past, and that is another problem in our part of the world, So I was looking at the trauma in regard to Bosnian war when I was visiting the Bosnian community, which lives in St. Louis, and I was analyzing it in my last book on the passion for ignorance. My shock there was how trauma continues going from generation to generation, especially when it is not dealt with, when people don't have the means to go through therapy, or when the maybe community does not address it. And quite often people do everything, to push it aside, not to deal with it. Unfortunately, trauma often emerges unexpectedly, even 20 years, 30 years after, and the person can become totally paralyzed because of it, although he or she lived presumably normally for quite some time. And for me it was interesting to observe that quite often it was like a small accident that kind of unleashed trauma. Let's say people were living, kind of presumably, stable lives, often working very hard. Sometimes work has been a way to push trauma aside. Let's say I encountered women who had 2 jobs, not simply because they needed money. They just wanted to be occupied, women whom I interviewed in the Bosnian community, those refugees. And then, let's say 25 years after the war, they would have a small accident. They would break a leg, they would have a small car accident, nothing terrible, and that small accident might unleash, the memory of trauma, which happened to them way back. And, that was for me an incredible kind of thing, how, trauma is, let's say, repressed, and then, just unexpectedly emerges and, paralyzes the person from then on.
Yeah, it's interesting how, and now we can slowly shift towards shift our focus towards the tyranny of choice. It's interesting how sometimes, in order to put our traumas or anxiety aside, we're running away from it by embracing the so-called rationalism or the rational choice. Trying to convince ourselves that we're rational human beings who should put our emotions aside, whatever we do. And especially if we're living under conditions of contemporary capitalism, which in a way normalized this vast number of choices that we are facing on a daily basis. There is a book by David Harvey, and the title is The Madness of Economic Reason. How do we balance the rational side of ourselves and the emotional side of ourselves in the contemporary era?
Yeah, I'm not denying that we are rational beings, but, when it comes to choices, we don't make, most of our choices totally in a rational way, which is something that is often forgotten. Whenever you look at analysis of choices, the question is, how can we make better choices? Like, how can we learn more about, choices? And then, when you look at exactly, how people are, behaving in regard to choices, you see, the rationality plays, a small part, So let's say, for example, we are very influenced by what society perceives as a good choice, what other people are choosing. We know from psychoanalysis that we are always questioning what is the desire of the other. Now, other, it might be another human being, but might be also the big other, society as such, So what might be a respectable choice to make in a particular society. And, then the second thing is when we already make a choice, even banal consumer choices, we are anxious over what we have chosen, which is why paradoxically people who are buying cars, after they already bought the car, start, passionately reading reviews about cars, reading like whether the car they bought is really good, did they make a mistake or not, and so on, although they already made a choice. Some people are so paralyzed that they can't make any choice, because they're constantly questioning, what to choose and so on. And then there is this unconscious mechanism where often we make choices in a way that, goes against our rational well-being.
A gut feeling.
Yeah, sometimes gut feeling, but also it might be actually, that we are making choices because of a certain unconscious, sort of like mechanism that is guiding us, about which we don't know. And as psychoanalysis knows very well, unfortunately, people are not making choices to sort of, let's say, minimalize their pain or to benefit themselves. So psychoanalysis goes against the utilitarian reason, which is saying that people are trying to maximize their well-being and minimalize their pain. Psychoanalysis says the opposite. Unfortunately, people are doing everything sometimes to kind of keep, kind of being miserable. Or, there is a certain paradoxical enjoyment in pain, not enjoyment in a positive way, but like what Lacan calls jouissance, kind of a pleasure in displeasure, which people cannot exit easily. And then second is that people are not actually trying to maximize their well-being. Often, again, they're doing the opposite, they're kind of preventing their well-being and, kind of, let's say, doing everything to not to succeed, we can say. So although our mantra is you should do everything to succeed, psychological mechanisms, might actually prevent us to come to some points of satisfaction, at least temporary happiness. I'm very critical of this obsession that we need to be happy. I think that the ideology which promotes happiness has created a lot of misery with people. Happiness happens, but for a short time, unexpectedly, and often it's not something we can, fight for or would last a long time, this kind of elevated feeling of happiness.
Is this battle actually for, you're discussing in your book, The Tyranny of Choice, also the notion of self-made man, of all these choices that we should make on a daily basis, not just by, I must admit that I read your book, The Tyranny of Choice, let's say 9 or 10 years ago, immediately after it was published, and I remember your vivid description of of the tyranny of choice when you went to the supermarket and you had a number of choices for cheese. And whenever I enter a supermarket, I remember that discussion of yours. But is that a lost battle in advance, that you are constantly trying to be, and also one of the key terms is responsibility. So if you're making a choice, you should make a responsible choice. That means informed choice. What I know that you probably cannot provide all the answers, but how can we deal with this also peer pressure from our environment when we see other people indeed studying really carefully all the details about the new car that they are about to buy, etc. How do we manage these situations?
After experiencing this tyranny of choice myself in regard to cheese, I think I became more blasé about it. I know that I will make a mistake. I'm not thinking too much. As already Freud said sometimes, there are choices which it's worth thinking long and hard, and then there are choices you just make. Actually, his idea was that sometimes it is about personal choices, whom we marry, to have children or not. Those are, sort of the choices where, thinking too long, will completely paralyze us sometimes, because you don't know what will be the outcome, to have
we
children.
Cannot know. We cannot.
And that's okay. That's okay. We should allow for a surprise and do less of, let's say, control of what outcome might come.
Even the unpleasant surprise.
Exactly. And it was interesting that part about, my paralyzing feeling of anxiety over cheese, which I actually had when I was shopping for cheese in a New York store. I was republished in a journal, in a magazine for wine connoisseurs, because I link my anxiety over cheese also over, the anxieties that people have over choosing the wine in the restaurant, where, people are questioning also how will other people regard them in regard to the choice of wine, whether other will look at them that they are stingy or, too extravagant or whatever, it's sort of, when we are making those choices, we see how society, the milieu where we live, plays an important role in regard to choices. When I was paralyzed over what cheese to buy for a dinner where I was going, my question was, how will my hosts regard me in regard to the choice of cheese? Because I knew they knew much more than I about, the types of cheeses that exist. So my question was, who am I in the eyes of my friends in regard to the choice that, I will show with the present that I will bring?
Mm-hmm. I know many examples of people who actually anxiety about choices such as choice of cheese is probably not as serious as anxiety when it comes to the choice of a life partner. Yeah. And there are many people who are staying with their partners and in a way trying to rationally measure whether that partner is suitable for having a family with. Mm-hmm. Is this something that is contemporary? Since, when we speak about the generation of, let's say, our grandparents, etc., it doesn't seem that they had too much time for overthinking, right? They were just making the choices everyone were making at the time, and then deal with the consequences. Do you think that new generations are actually more, let's say, fragile when it comes to dealing with the side effects of their choices?
Yes, they're definitely living in a different setting. First, choices in regard to potential love partners on the one side appear, vast, especially with internet. And that is blocking some people to make any decision. We know that people are often thinking something better is around the corner, and that, the question of, like why a person that I chose on internet then responded also to me. Let's say I was analyzing in the book Tyranny of Choice those kind of internet dating debates. A person might choose someone who appears, very beautiful, very educated or whatever on the internet, and then that person might respond positively, and then, the first person start thinking, what's wrong with this presumably ideal person that, they responded to me, like, so that
there must be something
there
wrong.
may be something wrong, I don't see myself maybe as up to, the standards that maybe this person is looking for. And then, of course, the constant changing, which especially Tinder introduced, So people now need to be prepared for constant rejections. We are kind of swiping when we are looking for the partners on the internet, and it is this kind of feeling that a person is so easily discarded. I think that is creating, quite a lot of an anxiety in internet dating. Now, of course, we can say that with this vast possibility of choice, there comes also sort of like a slight change in the way love has always operated. Now, love has always been linked to certain kind of perceptions of the market. In the past too, someone was in the market to find a partner, but the market was much more limited to the people that people knew personally, or they were in their vicinity, or they were introduced to them at the workplace, and so on. And of course, people had a little bit more information about another, because kind of there was a milieu in which people knew each other. Now we don't have this kind of information, so there is much more of an unknown. But we can see, of course, today more of a kind of a difficulty of youngsters to establish, relationships, especially because there is quite a lot of anxiety in regard to emotional openness. To open up oneself to another is an anxiety provoking. Love is also about enduring loss. Not only making the wrong choices, but, not making any choice because you are paralyzed, that you will make a certain kind of a mistake, you will expose yourself, you will show your vulnerability, and so on. So what I observe is much more of a kind of a protective shield that people are putting around themselves, which is reasonable in regard to the life we are living today, Especially, I would say, the possibility, first of all, to kind of appear, let's say, too vulnerable to others, and even at workplace.
To open up too much.
To open up too much. Even at workplace, people are much more cautious, because they feel that if they are too open, if they express themselves too much, that might damage them, it might be against their well-being. So that is contributing to the increase of loneliness that we observe, across many countries. In the UK, even they were even thinking whether they can establish a certain kind of, let's say, ministry of loneliness, whether the country can do something, a society, against this, quite enormous phenomenon.
Alienation is one of the key terms with that respect. On the one side, and you discussed that in the Tyranny of Choice, you have unlimited choices in this, let's say, urban capitalist world. And that's why many people choose actually to escape. And this escapistic strategy of, for instance, moving away from the big cities and going back to the nature. What do you think about this phenomenon and this trend, especially among younger people who just cannot handle the tyranny of choice that well, and simply choose to escape this sort of environment and live in an environment in which actually nature is the only scope within which there is a limited number of choices that you have.
Yeah, we have seen an increase of that during the pandemic, where people were moving outside of the cities. Some found, a certain kind of calmness there, but others, found other types of anxieties.
Yeah.
Also, anxiety related to kind of the lack of social contacts, the lack of possibilities to go to cultural events and so on. So we see also a kind of the opposite trend, especially in the United States, that people are starting to move back into cities. Not in huge numbers, but there are many who felt that they made too quick of a choice of this kind of escapism.
Is this a sort of addiction that we have developed within this urban way of life and so many choices, even though it harms us in a way, but in a way we're addicted to it?
Yeah, but life in big cities is becoming very stressful, especially with all the chaos of too much traffic, with sort of like I would say long commutes that people need to do if they work in the offices, which is why quite a lot of people are actually refusing to return back to offices.
After the pandemic.
After the pandemic, yes. After the pandemic, in the United States, in the UK, they are seeing like quite an emptiness of the buildings where previously there were offices because enterprises need fewer offices. A lot of people negotiate now that they want to work at least half a week at home, because they don't want to engage with these long commutes. It's kind of tiring. And also, nowadays we are living in times where, communicating over, sort of technology from afar is becoming totally acceptable. More and more students don't want to come to the class. Some universities are pressuring them to come, but students are perceived as consumers, and so they make their choice. So I think that post-pandemic times are different from the times that we lived before, and actually some people are also socializing much less. The kind of the socializing they had before the pandemic did not, for some people, kind of came back in the same way. Some friendships collapsed. We see, I think, a change in society and in the way people are functioning in the post-pandemic times. And of course, we are also negating the fact that another pandemic can come. We are not prepared as societies. We didn't do anything, to deal with the next pandemic, in a better way than we dealt with the last one.
Do you think that certain contexts, cultural, social, are better for individuals in a way? If you go to the Mediterranean part of Europe, or if you go to Istanbul, you still see these, people coming together at 11 p.m., midnight, 1 a.m., just discussing things, neighbors talking to each other over the window, etc. And then you have this, let's call it a Western type of society in which these situations, that the community is not as strong, and this everyday communication between people is not that strong. Where do you see the future? I mean, is this community type of society is going to prevail again in order to prevent further alienation of individuals, or you see? Or you think that it's more likely that people will get even more alienated, even more getting, staying alone in order to avoid all the mess and that is happening outside?
Yeah, it's interesting to mention Istanbul. I was just there for a month and a half, and we are having our institute an international research together with Turkey, Italy, and a couple of other countries about the turn of society into illiberal society. And so that's what we are also looking at in Turkey. And actually, my collaborators in Turkey have been saying that society is radically changing, also in regards to this kind of meeting, the communal spaces and so on. People are extremely stressed over, the economic situation. There is a very, very high inflation. There is a lack of hope that society will turn back into some kind of a democratic organization. There is also sort of, I would say, an anxiety in regard to how to oppose the regime. Is it at all possible, to oppose the regime, because the media has been, in the hands of Erdogan and his groups. There are very few independent media, and the long commutes are preventing people, to meet. So what my Turkish colleagues have been saying, that a lot of young are living in a kind of American fashion, which is that they are dealing with the economic situation by constantly going in debt. So they are paying things with credit cards.
But is it a generational issue then? Because when you go indeed to some neighborhoods in Istanbul, you can see older generations living this community life, and you're absolutely right that the younger generations are imitating what's the way of life that is being present in the West. Is it a generational issue? So also here in our
the
region?
Younger generation are definitely suffering more, because first of all they cannot often go away from their parents, because the housing situation is so terrible, so expensive, that they need to live, although they are employed, still with their parents. And for the consumption, yes, people go to bars. They're spending a lot of money in bars and restaurants and so on, but actually they are paying it with a credit card, and then they're kind of shuffling one credit card with another, paying just for interests. And that's kind of the American way, that you are creating this indebted
bubble
society. People are so indebted they don't see the way out, and that's kind of another anxiety provoking thing that we observe more and more around the world.
Okay, let's now turn to your last book, A Passion for Ignorance, that came out in 2020, and it was published by the Faculty of Media and Communication here in Belgrade this year, 2024. And it was just it came out in 2020, but even better moment for it is 2023 or 2024, the post-pandemic world in which we're actually analyzing and discussing what happened during the pandemic and why so many people had this ignorance or denial, as you distinguish the two terms, especially towards science. So maybe let's start with that discussion about people's ignorance towards science, towards epistemic authorities, and towards factual as such.
Yeah, that book I was finishing it just when the pandemic started, and later I wrote a new introduction to it when the war in Ukraine also started, where I saw very similar problem with the question of what is truth. So in the past, we had this idea that if only we can speak what is truth, So let's say in the new introduction I mentioned Václav Havel, who was saying, society needs to live in truth. And like in socialism, his idea was if people would truthfully say that they don't believe in the communist ideals, something might change. People were just pretending that they believe in what the party wanted them to believe. And we see that this type of reasoning, living in truth, is not operating anymore. People cannot find any common ground on what is truth or what are facts. We have a total disarray in society, where we have a lack of, identifications with kind of authorities, which is not necessarily bad. I'm not saying that, kind of a classical patriarchal society where people identify, with the leaders and so on was great. Change was necessary in regard to, the patriarchy, for example. However, we live now in society where, facts and opinions have no meaning, and in the way that people who have worked long to establish what certain kind of scientific knowledge are often easily disregarded. People are not necessarily thinking that what they are saying has any value, since we are living in the situation where just private opinions, personal views can have more authority in the internet sphere, especially. If we have an influencer with a lot of followers, that person can have, let's say, more power, let's say, in society than scientists who have worked long and hard to establish certain facts. So in this situation where we doubt everything, where we cannot come to any, let's say, at least temporary agreement of what is truth in a certain setting, what is a fact, we opened really the door to authoritarian leaders who are thriving in this disbelief, because the authoritarian leaders also do not even expect that people will believe them. Majority of authoritarian leaders are like performers nowadays. They are media personalities. They are reality type of shows. They are changing their image. They are changing their discourse. They are lying, constantly. If we look at Donald Trump, he was a master of that. No one could even count anymore the amount of lies. And that situation establishes, a feeling with people that, lying first is part of how the power functions, which opens the doors to a certain kind of, I would say, apathy, and a kind of a general disbelief. And that general disbelief allows, the structure of the neoliberal society, to get even stronger, I would say. So we don't expect belief. We actually expect a radical disbelief which pacifies people. This radical disbelief, coupled with the idea of choice. It is up to me to come to a conclusion whether the virus exists or not. It's up to me to decide whether vaccines are okay or not. So everything is in my hands. I'm responsible fully for myself and my children. That creates sort of bubbles of people who are, like monads deciding about, only their own well-being. And in the types of pandemic, that's quite scary, because you cannot prevent pandemic without, a communal decision. The pandemic, it's not only like an individual problem. It's not something that affects the illness that affects only an individual. It's the illness which spreads. So there is an interesting shift from the discourse of immunology. First being part, of medical sciences. At some point, the shift happened that immunology became also something we used in political science. Is society immune, to certain dangers? Does it have kind of a, let's say, strength or not? Can certain, let's say, disruptions happen, like a kind of social viruses? So we see that in today's society we are living, highly individual lives, where actually society as such is losing certain kind of a strength to deal with actual illnesses, but also to deal with, certain kind of, let's say, social factors, and of course to deal with ecological factors. That's kind of another thing, which is why it's not surprising that we have so many discussions now about what might bring civilizations to an end, what causes a collapse of society.
We know that this post-factual world, or post-truth, as many call it, it relies on the. It is not necessarily that people deny that there are facts. It is that facts have become irrelevant or less relevant when we choose or when we decide about what is going to happen with our lives, etc. And then on the other hand, we have this phenomenon that you also touched upon of through celebrities and people without expertise talking about very serious stuff, of attention economy. That there in this kind of super complex and dynamic world, everyone is struggling for this attention of audience, be it a political audience or commercial audience. Then how do we regain that relevance of facts when it comes to political decision making, when it comes to everyday choices, etc.?
This is incredibly difficult answer. I think things are a bit lost. If I'm not, I feel that we have not tackled kind of the problem of deep fakes, which are more and more present. Let's say fake news, conspiracy theories, the emotional influence they have on people, how they have the power, to kind of emotionally touch people. Especially, let's say, we are coming really into the times of deep fake. Where, in politics, deep fake has been used, will be used even more, to kind of swing the opinions of people. We are not understanding enough how to tackle, let's say, the emotional currents in society, which is where I think that authoritarian leaders, the liberal type of societies, are actually much more successful, in understanding how emotions of people work, and the oppositional forces or people who are fighting for some ideals linked to democracy, human rights, freedoms and so on, are losing, because it is against their principles to use the type of manipulations, emotional manipulations. Now, in the past, scientists, political scientists like Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe were thinking also about populism, whether populism can be reinterpreted. Ernesto Laclau idea was that populism is not necessarily right-wing, that, the left...
We saw this with Podemos and
exactly,
Spain.
Which were kind of, let's say, short-lived attempts to use populism, for some ideals, at least temporarily they were democratic ideals, So we don't know whether this is it is possible to create, kind of a pro-democratic, pro-human rights politics by, kind of steering certain emotions. And it is without emotions, people do not make, decisions. So if we look at climate change, in which way, let's say, movements that are dealing with climate change are using emotions, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Let's say, attacking, some paintings in the museums, For some, it might be a way to show that often we preserve more, a painting than lives of people on Earth. But in another way, it can steer negative emotions, which is why, people will be disgusted by such actions and might not be mobilized, to do maybe more about climate change. So I think that politics will need to rethink affects, emotions, also anxiety we spoke at the beginning, and also start to think, exactly how to fight about, what are facts, what are truth, not to really also forget really the power of investigative journalism, because, the opinions online, have, different, let's say, value than, kind of deeply researched, sort of investigative journalism, which, presents, I would say, facts, not simple, kind of personal opinions.
Do you think that in general terms, people, and also this is related to the second notion you're dealing with in this book, the notion of denial, but also with ignorance, with just choosing on purpose not to pay attention, not to see, not to perceive certain things. There is this hypothesis by Vivek Chiber in his book, The Class Matrix, in which he's arguing that the working class is not unaware of what is going on. It is just, it is resignation rather than the false conscious among the people. They are too pessimistic. They think they cannot change anything. How do we again regain that at least slight or the healthy dose of optimism among people that some change is possible? Because it cannot be that majority of people are simply disillusioned by what is going on around them, whether in countries like Turkey, whether in any other country in the world.
Yeah, in Turkey it was interesting when I spoke with people after the elections, where opposition was quite organized, before the elections, hoping that with certain unity they created, they might be able to change, this long governing of Erdogan and his group. And there was a difference between those who had hope and those who didn't have hope. Those who had high hopes before the elections, after the elections were lost, they became totally disillusioned. Everything collapsed for them. They became also very passive. They were thinking not to go to the next local elections because nothing can be changed. Those who actually didn't have high hopes were starting to think maybe there are other ways to change society. Maybe elections are not the only moment where something can change. Maybe we can organize in a civil society and in small groups and start doing something to in the long term change society. So some people started thinking, I think creatively, that they need to find other ways, not only every 4 years or 5 years, go to elections and then be disillusions. So there are organizations which are, dealing with the questions of human rights, dealing with how to organize civil society and so on, how to organize some forms of protests. I would say they are not having enormous influences, but nonetheless, there are the seeds of something to come. So actually, I might kind of have an optimism in regard to the power of civil society in some settings. In Slovenia, for example, civil society was incredibly strong before the last elections, and they actually helped, to mobilize people in a variety of ways. Some groups were, driving people to the elections. Some, were creating, long lists of what civil society demands actually from whoever will be in power. Mm-hmm. Civil society is still very active because it is looking at the current government, whether, they are fulfilling any promises or not. Unfortunately, not. And that's another, let's say, problem that we are facing. However, if we lose the civil society, then I think I will be even more pessimistic. Of course, civil society shouldn't be perceived only as democratic. Mm-hmm. Only, also right-wing, extreme right-wing, and so on can also have a very powerful civil society. So there is a battle in the civil society sphere also.
Okay. Renata, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.